because people failed to accept and explore the alternative hypothesis, which turned out to be factually correct.
So the first thing to point out is that whites are not politically all that exceptional. I'm going to blast through this so you can press pause or read the original article. First, free speech. Whites in the EU are worse than non-whites in the US on free speech. If you care about free speech, non-whites in the US are better than whites in the EU, and the question is about racist statements. It's not a bullshit free speech question. Now, it does depend on how the question is worded. For example, here, the question regarding speech supposedly designed to stir up racial hatred. Obviously, laws against such things are very Orwellian because any judge can just say you're trying to stir up racial hatred. But when you get more concrete, whites and non-whites are actually more in favor of free speech. You can see from Smith 2005 and from Sean Last's analysis of GSS data looking at support for free speech for someone labeled a racist, communist, or anti-American Muslim, and you can see those results there. For freedom of association, both whites and non-whites oppose freedom of association for whites. Now, whites to a lesser degree, but even whites still overwhelmingly oppose the right of whites to have their own spaces. For gun laws, it looks like whites are massively in favor of gun rights compared to blacks and Hispanics, but this is a very vague question. When broken down to specific policies, the gaps are smaller and insignificant in terms of actual policies because there's no specific law regarding guns where whites and non-whites have a different majority response. And you can press pause to look through, or you can click on the links if you want to know more. On the economy, if we talk in platitudes, there's big racial differences, but on specifics, the racial gaps are much smaller, and overwhelmingly, a majority of whites support raising the minimum wage. On healthcare, whites, like non-whites, support a public option so long as it's not called Obamacare. If it's called Obamacare, whites will oppose it, and whites and non-whites oppose any government cuts to healthcare, whether or not tax cuts are mentioned. On welfare spending, more whites support cuts than non-whites, but still, whites on the whole do not support any welfare cuts, and they oppose cuts to Medicare and food stamps. On affirmative action, there appears to be a very big racial difference. However, this difference is reduced once you get to more concrete questions. In the abstract, it's a lot bigger than it is on more concrete questions. For example, when talking about college admissions, 61% of Hispanics and 50% of blacks support applicants being admitted solely on merit, meaning they don't support racial discrimination on the application itself. On the matter of whether or not race or ethnicity should factor into admissions decisions, 57% of blacks say no, 47% of Hispanics say no, and 67% of whites say no. So there are racial differences there, but at most you're looking at a 20% gap. For reparations, Latinos are fairly split on whether confirmed descendants of slaves should be given reparations, but they're more opposed when it's asked whether blacks in general should get reparations. And this is an issue where the racial differences actually are a little bit bigger. On immigration, whites are more in favor of building the wall than non-whites, according to a Reuters poll, but a Quinnipiac poll shows more opposition to the wall for all groups. Whites oppose it less in the Quinnipiac poll, but they still oppose it. Now, support for the wall used to be much higher before Trump politicized the issue, and now support for it is lower than it was in 2016, or before 2016. On illegal immigrants, 57% of whites want all or most deported, according to one poll, while only 33% of non-whites want all or most deported. For illegal immigrants already in the US, whites, blacks, and Hispanics overwhelmingly support amnesty. Amnesty is super popular, and this finding is replicated in a PRI poll. From a CNN poll, 56% of whites believe the most important issue is developing a pathway to citizenship for the illegals, far more important than controlling the border. For non-whites, it's even higher, and only 28% of whites and 24% of non-whites support deporting all illegals. Interestingly, when you binary distill the question like this, it shows much less differences between whites and non-whites than does asking about sort of priority. Non-whites also in the majority support making it a crime to hire an illegal and support increasing the number of Border Patrol agents, though whites support both items to a much more substantial degree. And that's from Reuters. A Gallup poll asking a similar question found much more support for blacks and Hispanics in terms of tightening border security. Okay, so the point of this is not to say, oh, how wonderful Hispanics and blacks in the United States are. It's just to show how unexceptional whites are. Yes, whites are a little better on just about every issue, but not to such a degree that one should base an entire ideology around the superior political views of whites versus non-whites, at least in the context of the United States. If you want to say it's not about such things, it's about my people, right or wrong, okay, well, I would have to call into question whether they really are your people if they don't care about their own existence and think that steps taken to preserve their existence and sovereignty are hateful and bigoted, and you're demonic for even proposing such things. In the political conflict in the United States, the functional battle lines are not strictly racial. Though racial issues constitute locales of conflict, the lines are Republican-Democrat Party, binary, a true dichotomy. One thing I said in the video I took down was that I'm just sick of sticking up for people that won't stick up for themselves, that doesn't care about itself. People in Ireland are so far gone that they will consider a black guy in Dublin who hates the Irish for being racist. They'll figure this guy to be more Irish than their flesh and blood ancestors living in the United States, because the black guy speaks with an Irish accent and has a sticker placed on him by the government that he's Irish. It's that retarded. When you break down white people, even in the United States, you see massive differences between European ethnicities in terms of party registration. Differences of roughly the same magnitude as that between whites and Hispanics and Asians. In terms of income, at the extreme ends, gaps between European ethnic groups within the United States are of similar magnitude as that between whites and Hispanics, or even whites and blacks. The point of this isn't fuck you for being poor, it's just to highlight that there are really profound differences within the greater European population. There's no singular European population, and these differences are almost certainly to some degree genetic. We would presume so, given that European ethnic differences within the United States are no longer salient. Irish aren't being treated differently from the descendants of Englishmen, who aren't being treated differently from the descendants of Frenchmen. They're all just treated as whites. So when we're looking at differences between European ethnic groups within the United States, the fact that their ethnicity is largely hidden at this point, but yet these differences still remain, is a strong implication that these are genetically based. One issue that was very important to me was regression toward the mean. Basically, if you have a trait that is exceptional for your breeding population, then your offspring will regress back toward the breeding population average to the extent that your exceptional traits are not a function of additive genetic effects, meaning that non-additive genetic effects and environmental effects are generally not passed on to offspring in animals, and for humans this is very much true for IQ. Environmental effects are generally not passed on intergenerationally in terms of things relevant for IQ. However, for political party support, the heritability inferred from twin studies is only 0.3 as opposed to 0.8 for IQ. But the parent-offspring correlation for political party support is around 0.8, meaning that, unlike IQ, parents have a huge impact on political party support of their offspring. So, Sean just plugged in the breeder's equation and estimated regression values on political views for Asians, blacks, and Hispanics and whites based on a heritability of 0.3. And he found that in this worst case scenario, Asians and Hispanics who rate themselves as 5 or 6 on a 1 to 6 point scale of how Republican they are, with 6 being the most Republican, they will have offspring who remain Republican into the next generation. And this is assuming zero parental environmental effects. So this is a kind of absolute worst case scenario. This is about the maximum that they would regress. So the flight risk of non-white conservatives or non-whites who hold quote unquote our values or right-wing values, the risk of that flying is greatly exaggerated. I'm tired of being a chump, or to use internet lingo, a cuck for some idealized white race that doesn't exist and never existed. What I did, and what I think white nationalists in general do, is look at the reality of other races but look at whites like a work in progress, as fallen from who they really are, the real white race. That's what I thought, and I think it came from a misreading of history. The founders of the US were definitely pan-European white nationalists. And so, in a sense, the United States was founded in a pan-European white nationalism. And before, I saw this as living proof of pan-Europeanism. Not that I wanted Europe to become this way, not that I had some great desire to wipe Poland from the map, but simply that the United States was proof that it could work. And, well, maybe Brazil, in a sense, works in the sense that it hasn't exploded yet, but there isn't some great white solidarity in the United States except in a very specific situation, and that was when whites lived near blacks. The increasing proportion of a county that is Asian or Hispanic does not cause the whites there to become more conservative. Increasing the proportion that is black, however, does. Which is to say that in the United States, white nationalism is increased by exposure to blacks, but not Asians or Hispanics. There could be some other groups that have this racial radicalization effect on whites. Mike Enoch suggested that perhaps contact with Hasidic Jews could also radicalize whites into becoming white nationalists. But in general, whites don't become white nationalists, except in a very specific situation. And so when you look at the reality of white people, they have really shitty views on just about every issue, and they have almost no racial solidarity, and they don't seem to care too much about whether or not they exist or are sovereign as a racial group. And this is just the reality. And trying to say that this is some false reality created by some corruption, I think that's just delusional. To think that, well, the true white people aren't like this. The true white people have been corrupted by the Jew, and that's why they're like this. And I think that's a very easy cop-out, instead of just recognizing that you're not into white people, you're into the ideal of. One argument I got on my last video is that what I'm talking about is a proposition state, because I'm basically talking about taking over state governments and not necessarily seceding all at once, or even ever fully seceding formally, but forming a block of states that work together to gradually just act and take over functions of the federal government. The biggie being, over time, after taking over governorships, putting loyalists in the bureaucracy, building up an effective National Guard, is for a block of states to take over their own immigration policy. And the point is to form a block of states that can act, that can just do, that don't ask permission. The courts make noise, and these states will then just declare the courts to be in contempt of Constitution, at which point it is up to the president and the army to decide what they want to do from there. It's important to do this and to just act, and to not piss around with the courts and what the federal courts are going to say. Another path would be a constitutional amendment creating domain-specific state supremacy and fencing of federal funds. For example, on all matters of domestic welfare and regulation, state law could trump federal law, but maintain things like right of passage and the right of federal taxation for military purposes. But any federal tax is fenced. There's a military tax, maybe an infrastructure tax, but no general taxation and no general fund. Such a strategy could conceivably work with California. For example, California certainly wants open borders and sanctuary cities. Cool, as long as our block of states is allowed to have a secure border and perhaps even a border wall with California. Both states have radically different goals, but both have a common interest in state supremacy to achieve those goals. Now, could such a deal be made? I don't know. And there's no real point in over-planning what to do, but an effective strategy here would be to act on a state level. I'm not a white nationalist. I don't think of myself as a civic nationalist, but if you want to call me that, sure, whatever. But when I hear I'm putting forth a proposition state versus an American white nationalist who says he supports a real flesh and blood group of people, a real nation, well, I think U.S. conservative is more of a real nation than U.S. whites are. U.S. conservatives are deeply territorial, work constantly for the supremacy of their beliefs, are increasingly intolerant of mixed ethnicity marriages. You know, in the case of the conservatives and liberals mixing, right? The ethnicity of the conservatives and the ethnicity of the liberals mixing. I jest a little bit here, but you tell me, how does U.S. conservative not function as an ethnicity and as far as I can see, a more vital and robust ethnicity than white American. One thing I talked about in my previous video was immigration vetting based on political views and how you could screen liars. You can screen liars based on autonomic things like disgust response or the blink response or the ability to maintain eye contact, along with party registration from the state they're coming from. For example, an immigrant from California, well, you'd want to know his party registration, what neighborhood he came from, his autonomic responses, blink response, disgust response, ability to maintain eye contact, his race, his facial structure, and put all that data in an algorithm and figure with probably 95% accuracy over a 90% confidence interval what his political views are. And people have been commenting on this and how this is gangly and unwieldy, and not really. I mean, truthfully, you could do all these tests in about 10 minutes per person if you have someone doing it quickly and you have a system in place to do it quickly. I mean, it's a little bit complicated to explain, but once you have it up and running and people doing it, it wouldn't be that complicated. And you could say that this is utopian and I'm talking about things that will probably never come to pass, and that's fine, but you have to talk about these things because when you're talking about what it is you're proposing, you have to have answers to these kinds of questions, and that's my answer on the immigration policy on this conservative ethno-state, so to speak. But see, all this is assuming that there are even people who will try to lie to get in, which there probably wouldn't be a whole lot of. But see, political discrimination is far more socially acceptable than racial discrimination in the United States. And there are several states in the US that still allow political discrimination. But political discrimination is actually a kind of genetic discrimination to the extent that political views are partly genetically determined, and a form of ethnic discrimination in the sense that conservatives and liberals are functionally ethnicities. And if you want to say no, these aren't functional ethnicities but are just ideologies that can't be an ethnicity, well, what's Mormonism? That's clearly an ideology of a sort, but they've clearly also functioned as an ethnicity, as Mormons, as the Mormon bloc. And they have an obvious racial core to the Mormon religion, but it's not strictly speaking racially exclusive, especially regarding their outreach to the Polynesians. What is Judaism? Is there a Jewish race? Sure, but it's also a religion, but also an ethnicity. U.S. conservatism is similar. Its race core could be distilled to a segment of Anglo-Americans. Anglo-Americans could be seen as the conservative race, but surrounding that racial core are non-racial conservatives, just as there are non-racial Jews. For example, black Jews, just as there are some black conservatives. I'm not saying to codify any of this or formalize this. I'm just noting the similarity of U.S. conservatism to Judaism in terms of there being a racial core and U.S. conservatism, like Judaism, functioning as a race, as an ethnicity, and as a religion, or in this case, ideology. So, is what I'm talking about a proposition state? Sure, in the sense that Israel is a proposition state because Judaism is a religion, not a race. It's more complicated than that, right? It's not reducible to a soundbite. In my video, The European Revolution, I talk about how violent criminals were selected out of the gene pool, and the upper economic 1/3 replaced the bottom 2/3 genetically within Western Europe. And then they did it again. So the poor were genetically replaced by the rich twice, from around 1100 to 1800, over 700 years. But this effect was most concentrated in what is called the North Sea area, which was northeastern France, the Dunkirk region, Flanders, the Netherlands, and southeastern England. And this massive genetic change that occurred during this time period corresponded with the end of feudalism, the creation of common markets, which made mass production economical, with the rise of modern financing, which, along with the genetic change in the population that was predisposed to take advantage of modern financial instruments, created a class of people who both worked, but could also buy not entire companies or ventures to India, but stock in companies and ventures to buying up tea in China. A middle class who both labored and owned some means of production, which led to the privatization of agriculture, which led to increased yields with even less people working on the farms, which resulted in an explosion in the urban labor pool, which was then employed in the mass production industries. Mass production industries that were enabled by the deregionalization of markets and the creation of an English common market with a common financial law and transaction law through the whole of England, which then enabled industrial mass production And at that point, we basically have the Industrial Revolution. And it's those characteristics, the difference between the Western European from 1100 AD and 1800 AD, that's the stuff of the modern world. It's that difference is the essence of the modern world. And if you want to say, I'm a nationalist of something, that's what I'm a nationalist of. The difference between Europeans in 1100 AD and 1800 AD. And the highest concentration of this we'll call the First World strain that originated in Northwest Europe is, I believe, in the United States today in the Anglo-American population. So do you see how this all ties together? That this Anglo-American ethno-religion, which has come to be called conservatism, is the child of the European Revolution and the father of the Industrial Revolution and hence the modern world. My error was confusing this all with whites, thinking that this is, in a way, the true expression of white people generally, but no, it's the expression of the First World strain that is most concentrated today in Anglo-Americans, but originated in the North Sea area. And so I see this as my people, or at least the people that I identify with. And what they did was so great and so good. And white nationalism was just a facsimile of this, a proxy for this. I valued white nationalism to the extent it was a highly diluted proxy of this. And for the United States, because U.S. whites have this supremely high concentration of those most heavily impacted by the European Revolution, white nationalism for me was synonymous with those traits that created First World civilization. But in a global context, and even within a large chunk of the white population of the United States, that's simply not true. And so my nationalism, I guess, if you want to call it that, is much narrower in a sense, but it's also much broader. Because as an ethno-religion, it's not necessarily limited to a specific racial group. 7 months ago, I almost had this figured out. I was so close, but then for whatever reason, I got tracked back into a generalized pan-European white nationalism. And I think I ended up making the same errors that the founders of the United States made. Or maybe I'm just cucking out, or quitting, or maybe I just got black-pilled or something, guys. And people say black-pilled, and sure, maybe whatever. I mean, I guess you could say I'm black-pilled RE pan-European white nationalism, sure. But what people saying this, they're not getting is that this is not really about being black-pilled per se. This is a major change in how I view things, and I know that it invalidates some of the stuff I said previously, but so much more is tied together. The European Revolution, ethno-religions, and now this data on how other groups of whites do not behave like those from the North Sea area, which was ground zero of this genetic change I talked about in the European Revolution. But if you ask the question, am I in favor of a proposition state? My answer would just have to be sure. If you asked me if I was in favor of an ethno-state, my answer would be sure, because the First World core of the American conservative movement is the ethno-religion of those most First World people, the sons of the European Revolution. Right, First World is sons of the European Revolution. I like how that sounds, but maybe it's a little bit cheesy, and I'm probably going to get made fun of for it. So there you have it. Is this a repudiation of white nationalism? Kind of. Certainly of pan-Europeanism, but it's not a white racial thing per se. It just looked that way because of the First Worldist strain within the United States at a specific place and time. European populations with less of that strain think and vote more as other racial groups do. But it also makes it clear going forward that there is no reason to keep the ethno-religion purely white. I believe that previously because I believe there was a civilizational imperative in keeping Europeans in charge, but that's only true insofar as those white people have that First Worldist strain. If they don't, then it won't matter so much, unless you're talking about Africans, but they're kind of unique among the races and their traits. What is important and what literally created the world as we know it is an extension of the Industrial Revolution, is the First World strain originating from the North Sea area, most concentrated today in Anglo-Americans, and their informal religion, which in the United States today has come to be called conservatism. Of course, it has been bastardized and it has been warped just as any religion can be. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think I finally figured out, I guess in a sense, who my real people are, and I instinctively sort of got it when the question of non-Europeans came to me, and non-Europeans asked me if they would be allowed into, hypothetically King Ryan's ethno-state. And my instinct was absolutely. So my instinct seemed to understand that this was non-whites wanting to join the European Revolution, and how could you possibly say no? You could possibly say no if you were a blinkered white nationalist. That's how you could possibly say no.